Your patio can be hot enough to punish lettuce and still grow sweet summer fruit. But choose the wrong vine, miss what is happening at the flowers, or cut one melon too early, and weeks of healthy green growth can leave you with almost nothing worth bringing into the kitchen. That is the strange thing about growing fruit in containers. The plant can look successful long before the harvest is actually safe. That changes the first question. Do not ask only, can watermelon grow in a container? Ask, which watermelon am I asking this container to support? Those are very different questions. A seed packet can say watermelon on the front and still describe a plant that wants to run across half the patio. Another packet can give you a personal size fruit on a shorter vine. A third can give you a compact-looking plant with a fruit heavy enough to remind you that small foliage does not always mean a small load. The first watermelon I would look at is Mini Love. This is exactly the kind of fruit that changes the way a beginner thinks about watermelon. The vine is much shorter than the sprawling types many people picture, and the fruit is personal size. That does not mean you can drop 3 plants into a tiny herb pot and expect the roots to sort it out. Small fruit is not permission to crowd the root zone. What it gives you is a more manageable plant to plan around. For a compact melon vine, I would think in terms of a real food-growing container, not a decorative 3-gallon pot. Around 10 to 15 gallons gives a much more forgiving root zone for one vigorous fruiting plant. And the exact choice still depends on the cultivar, the potting mix, and how aggressively you plan to train the vine. The important point is simple. Start with enough root room that the plant is not fighting the container before flowering even begins. And this is where many container gardeners make a mistake that is almost invisible on planting day. They choose the smallest pot that looks acceptable because the seedling is small. But the seedling is not the problem you are designing for. You are designing for the plant 6 or 8 weeks into active summer growth, when leaves are pulling water, flowers are opening, and developing fruit begins competing for the same root system. A pot that felt generous in spring can feel very small in the heat of midsummer. Mini Love is useful because its shorter vine makes space planning easier. You can direct it along a low support, guide it beside a railing, or let part of the vine trail into a controlled area, but do that planning early. Once several feet of soft new growth have wrapped through chair legs, other pots, and a tomato cage, "I'll organize it later," becomes a very expensive sentence in terms of broken stems. The next watermelon makes the lesson more interesting. Cal Sweet Bush has a compact, bushy habit, but the fruit can be surprisingly substantial. This is where I want you to separate the size of the plant from the weight of the crop. A compact plant can save horizontal space and still ask the roots to support a serious fruit. So do not see the word bush and immediately reach for the smallest container in the store. Think about the whole system. The potting mix has weight. The water you add has weight. The plant has weight. Then, the fruit develops. If you plan to move the container during the season, perhaps to escape reflected heat or to protect the plant during a storm, a large rigid pot can become difficult to handle. A stable grow bag, a container on a strong plant caddy, or simply placing the pot correctly before the plant fills out can save you from trying to drag a heavy fruiting system across the patio later. And watch what happens to your assumptions here. Mini Love teaches that a personal size fruit can come from a shorter vine. Cal Sweet Bush teaches that a small plant can still carry a larger fruit. Already, 2 watermelons have given us 2 different container problems. That is why grow watermelon in a pot is not a complete plan. Now consider Mexican miniature watermelon. The reason I like this example is not only the fruit, it is the habit of reading the cultivar name before you read the crop name. Imagine standing in a garden center and seeing 6 seed packets that all say watermelon. If you stop there, you are making the decision with the least useful word on the packet. Watermelon tells you what you are growing. The cultivar description tells you what you are asking your patio to handle. Look for vine habit. Look for fruit size. Look for words such as personal size, bush, short-vined, compact, or suitable for small spaces. Then compare that information with the actual container and the actual area where the vine will go. A balcony with a sturdy trellis is not the same as a sunny driveway with 10 feet of open edge. A deck with intense reflected afternoon heat is not the same as a patio with shade arriving at 4 o'clock. The best cultivar is the one that fits the system you already have, not the one with the most dramatic fruit photo. And then Ruby Firm gives us another useful warning. The fruit is personal size, close to the kind of melon that feels easy to carry into the kitchen and eat without needing a family reunion. But a smaller fruit does not automatically mean a short vine. This is one of the most important distinctions in the whole video. Fruit size and vine size are two different questions. A gardener can easily choose a personal size watermelon because the fruit looks perfect for a pot, then discover that the vine still wants to travel. That does not make the variety a bad choice. It means you need to plan for where the vine goes. Let it trail across a clean, open edge. Train it vertically if the support is strong enough and the fruit can be supported. Or guide it around the back of the container group where it will not be crushed underfoot. By the fourth watermelon, the pattern should be clear. Small fruit, short vine, and container-friendly are three separate traits. A seed packet may give you one of them, two of them, or all three. And if you remember only one thing from these first fruits, remember this: choose the habit before you choose the picture. Now, the vines start moving, and the patio problem changes. You are no longer deciding whether the fruit fits in a pot. You are deciding where every new foot of growth is allowed to go. This is where Minnesota midget cantaloupe earns its place. The fruit is small, and the vines are much shorter than the sprawling melon plants many gardeners expect. On a small patio, that changes the geometry of the garden. Instead of allowing a vine to disappear under furniture or crawl through every neighboring container, you can decide on a simple path and keep checking it while the stems are still flexible. I like to give a melon vine direction before it demands direction. If you want it to climb, install the support early. A trellis around 5 or 6 feet tall can be useful for many small fruited vines, but strength matters more than a pretty shape. Push, brace, or fasten the support so that a summer storm cannot turn the whole system into a sail. Remember that the trellis is not holding an empty vine forever. It may eventually hold wet foliage, multiple stems, and fruit. Guide young vines loosely. Do not cinch a plastic tie around a stem until it looks like a belt around a growing tree. A soft tie or clip should guide, not strangle. Check the contact points as the plant grows. Melon stems can be surprisingly easy to damage when you try to bend an older section sharply in a new direction. If a vine has already chosen a path, work with the curve you have instead of forcing a perfect diagram. Minnesota midget is also a good reminder that airflow still matters in a compact garden. The goal is not to compress every leaf into the smallest possible footprint. If 4 pots are packed together so tightly that the foliage becomes one damp green wall, you may have solved the patio space problem by creating a different management problem. Give the leaves enough separation that you can see into the plant, inspect the stems, and water at soil level without soaking everything above. Now, honeybun changes the story again. Its bushier habit can make it appealing where horizontal space is limited. At first, this looks like the perfect answer. Less wandering, a neater footprint, and small melons. Then, the plant begins flowering. This is where a compact plant can look absolutely perfect and still fail to give you the thing you planted it for. The leaves are green. New growth is coming. Yellow flowers open. A beginner sees all that activity and assumes fruit is inevitable. But flowering is not the same as fruit set. I am not going to solve the pollination mystery yet, because I want you to notice how easy it is to misdiagnose the plant before you understand the flowers. A bush habit solves a space problem. It does not solve pollination for you. So when honeybun is covered in flowers, resist the urge to celebrate the harvest before you see developing fruit. Also resist the opposite reaction. Do not assume the plant needs more fertilizer simply because you are not seeing melons. We are going to look closely at the flowers in a moment, and that one small observation may save you from feeding a plant that was never asking for more nitrogen. Before we get there, Lambkin Christmas melon gives us another lesson about the phrase container-friendly. This fruit is a Peel de Sapo type, and the vine can still spread several feet. That is not a contradiction. A plant can be manageable with its roots in a container and still need real space above the soil. Container-friendly describes where the root system can be managed. It does not promise that every leaf and stem will stay politely inside the rim. That sentence matters because many people place a container first and think about the vine later. They put the pot beside a walkway because the spot gets good sun. 3 weeks later, the vine is crossing the path. They move it to the other side. A week later, it is wrapped through a chair. Then they add a small decorative trellis, but by that point the vine has already grown past it. Reverse the order. Decide where the vine can travel. Then place the container. If the vine will climb, install the support before the plant needs it. If the vine will trail, give it a clean path, where feet, pets, and hot metal furniture are not constantly threatening the stems. The pot is only the starting point. The mature plant occupies a three-dimensional space. Lambkin is also where I would pay more attention to the surface of the container. A melon pot sitting on dark pavement can heat differently from the same pot sitting on wood, soil, or a lighter surface. You do not need to panic every time the container feels warm. But if the side of a dark pot is receiving hard afternoon sun and the mix is drying rapidly, that is information. Later, when we talk about root zone moisture, I will show you why changing the way you check the pot can be more useful than simply adding another automatic watering time. Then we reach orange silver wave, and this is where the trellis becomes more than a way to save floor space. The fruit can be large enough that support matters. If a melon is growing vertically, do not wait until it feels heavy in your hand before deciding how to support it. The support looks unnecessary when the fruit is the size of a golf ball. That is exactly why the job is easiest then. A simple sling can be made from breathable fabric, soft mesh, or another material that supports the melon without sealing it in a wet pocket. Place the sling beneath the developing fruit and attach the ends securely to the trellis. Leave room for the fruit to expand. The goal is to create a hammock, not a tight bandage. Do not tie the fruit itself to the support. Do not wrap a cord around the stem. And do not make the sling so shallow that the melon rolls out as it gains weight. Use your hand to imagine the fruit twice its current size. Will the sling still cradle it? Will the attachment points still hold? Can air move around the fruit? This is one of those garden jobs that feels overly cautious until the day a heavy melon pulls against a stem after a storm. Then the 5 quiet minutes you spent making a sling suddenly look very sensible. Vertical growing also changes the way you inspect the plant. When the fruit is lifted, you can see it more easily. You can check the stem area. You can notice damage. You can watch the rind change. But visibility can make people touch the fruit too often. You do not need to squeeze a developing melon every morning. Inspect it with your eyes first. Look for steady growth, intact skin, and a healthy connection to the vine. And while the trellis gives us a beautiful visual payoff, it does not create a fruit. A strong support can hold a melon only after the plant has successfully made one. That brings us back to those yellow flowers. By this point, imagine the patio looking wonderfully productive. Mini watermelons are guided along their paths. Short cantaloupe vines stay close to their containers. A longer melon climbs a sturdy trellis. One developing fruit rests in a sling. The garden is green, organized, and full of flowers. And that is exactly why the next failure is so frustrating. The garden can look successful before it has successfully made a single fruit. Amy Canary melon is where I would stop and diagnose the flowers before I touch the fertilizer. The vine can be healthy, the leaves can be full, and the plant can open flower after flower without turning every bloom into fruit. If that is happening, the first question is not, what should I feed it? The first question is, what kind of flowers am I looking at? And is pollen reaching the ones that can make fruit? N. Look just behind the flower. On melons and watermelons, a female flower has a swollen structure at its base that resembles a tiny version of the fruit. It may look like a miniature melon sitting behind the petals. A male flower sits on a slimmer stem, without that little fruit-shaped swelling. Once you see the difference clearly, the whole plant becomes easier to read. Male flowers often appear first. That can worry a beginner who is expecting a melon behind every yellow bloom. Do not assume the plant is broken. Watch the next flush of flowers. When female flowers begin opening, pay attention in the morning while the blooms are fresh and pollinators are active. And here is the important part, that flower is not waiting all week for you to notice it. Flowering gives us a narrow, living window. Bees and other pollinators normally do much of the work, but a small balcony, a screened space, periods of very hot weather, or simply low pollinator activity can leave a gardener staring at flowers without good fruit set. Hand pollination is not magic, and it does not fix every fruit problem, but it is a useful tool when you have fresh male and female flowers open at the same time. The simplest method does not require special equipment. Choose a freshly opened male flower. Gently remove the petals if they are blocking your access to the pollen-bearing center. Then touch that center against the center of a freshly opened female flower. Make gentle contact in more than one spot. You are trying to transfer pollen, not crush the bloom. A small soft artist brush can also work. Touch the brush to the pollen on the male flower, then transfer that pollen to the center of the female flower. If you use a brush, keep it clean and dry. The advantage of the flower-to-flower method is that it is very easy to understand when you are learning. The advantage of a brush is that you can work carefully without removing a male flower. Do this in the morning when the flowers are fresh. Then leave the female flower alone and watch the base over the next several days. If pollination and the rest of the plant's conditions are favorable, that tiny swelling may begin to enlarge. If it yellows, shrivels, or stops, poor pollination is one possibility. But do not reduce every failed fruit to a single cause. This is where the story gets more interesting. Amy Canary melon gives you a very visible color change later as the rind moves toward a strong yellow at maturity. But long before harvest, the plant is asking you to read a much smaller clue, the difference between flowers. That is the kind of gardening knowledge that changes a container from decoration into a system you can diagnose. And notice the mistake we avoided. A gardener sees green leaves and many flowers, but no fruit. The gardener adds a high nitrogen feed, hoping to push the plant harder. The vine responds with even more foliage. Now the plant looks more impressive, but the original pollination problem has not been solved. More growth can even make the small space garden harder to manage. Before you feed the plant again, look at the flowers. That one sentence is worth remembering for cucurbit vines in containers. Fertility matters, of course. Melons are not growing from air and optimism, but diagnosis should come before reaction. Ask whether female flowers are present. Ask whether pollinators are visiting. Look for the tiny swollen ovary. Consider hand pollination when it makes sense. Then evaluate the rest of the plant. Melamon takes us one step beyond that moment, because seeing a tiny fruit is encouraging, but it is not the finish line. A little melon behind a fading flower can make you feel as though the difficult part is over. Then 2 or 3 hot afternoons pass. The fruit stops swelling, the color looks wrong, and the gardener wonders what happened. Pollination is one question. Now I want to know what happened below the soil during the hottest part of the afternoon. This is the point where I would put my hand into the potting mix, rather than looking only at the leaves. Push a finger about 1 to 2 inches below the surface in a place where you are not tearing through the main stem or exposed roots. The top ½ inch can become dry and dusty, while the mix below still holds moisture. The opposite problem can happen in a shallow or very porous container. The surface may look acceptable in the morning, while much of the root zone loses moisture rapidly by late afternoon. Do not use the color of the surface as your only watering meter. If the root zone is dry, water slowly at the soil level. Let the mix absorb the water instead of blasting one corner so quickly that the water channels down the side and exits before the center is evenly moistened. In a very dry peat-based mix, the first pass of water may run through or bead away. Apply some water, pause, and water again so the mix has time to accept moisture. Continue until the root zone is thoroughly moistened and excess water can drain from the bottom. Drainage is not optional. A melon container without effective drainage can create a completely different kind of stress. The plant may wilt, leaves may look tired, and a gardener who assumes hot day equals thirsty plant may pour even more water into a saturated root zone. That is why the condition of the mix matters more than the clock. A watering schedule tells you what time it is. The root zone tells you whether the plant needs water. Remember that line, when summer becomes extreme. A 10 or 15-gallon container exposed to direct sun, wind, and reflected heat may behave very differently from the same size pot on another patio. One gardener may need to check moisture again late in the day during a hot, dry spell. Another gardener, with a larger pot, moisture-retentive mix, and some afternoon protection, may find the root zone still comfortably moist. Both can be correct. The mistake is copying a watering time without checking the container you actually own. Melon is also a good place to think about fruit load realistically. A container plant has limited root volume. That does not mean you should automatically remove every fruit but one, and it does not mean you should leave every tiny ovary and hope for a mountain of melons. Watch the plant. Is growth still active? Are the leaves maintaining good color? Is the root zone staying stable? Are several fruits enlarging, or are many tiny fruits repeatedly stalling? The answer may differ by cultivar and container. I do not want to invent a universal, keep exactly 3 fruits rule for 14 different crops. The useful skill is learning to read whether the plant is supporting active fruit development instead of relying on a number copied from a completely different variety. That tiny melon behind the flower is a beginning, not a promise. And once you understand that, the hottest part of the video is no longer the air above the patio. It is the small volume of potting mix holding the entire root system. Trellis strawberry is useful here because it changes the shape of the garden and exposes the root zone problem in a different way. We have spent a long time following vines, trellises, and hanging melons. A compact strawberry plant looks simpler. It sits low. It can live in a pot or hanging basket. The fruit is small, but the roots are shallow, and the container itself can become a heat trap. Imagine a dark plastic pot sitting beside a sunlit wall on a paved patio. The leaves may receive the same sunlight you expected when you chose a fruiting plant, but the roots are living inside a small box whose temperature and moisture can change quickly. Reflected heat from concrete or brick can make that microclimate harsher than the air temperature reported for your neighborhood. This is why I do not describe summer container care with the phrase, water every morning and forget it. Start by checking the root zone. If the top 1 or 2 inches are drying and the plant is actively using water, irrigate thoroughly at soil level. If the mix is still moist below the surface, do not add water, simply because the clock reached your normal watering time. During unusually hot, dry, windy weather, check again later. The act of checking takes less time than trying to rescue a plant after days of repeated moisture swings. A thin mulch layer can help slow moisture loss from the surface. Around 1 to 2 inches is often enough in a container. Keep the material from being packed tightly against the crown or main stem. You are trying to shade the surface and reduce rapid drying, not build a wet wall around the plant. Container color and placement can matter too. If a dark nursery pot becomes extremely hot in reflected afternoon sun, placing it inside a slightly larger, light-colored outer container can reduce direct solar heating of the pot wall, as long as you do not trap standing water around the drainage holes. You can also move a portable strawberry container away from the harshest reflected heat. That is one of the advantages of growing in pots. Mobility is part of the system, but use shade carefully. A fruiting plant still needs enough light to photosynthesize and produce. The answer is not to hide every summer container in a dark corner. The goal is to reduce the most punishing microclimate when the container itself is overheating, while maintaining the light the crop needs. And do not confuse normal temporary afternoon droop with a diagnosis. Some plants can look tired during the hottest hours and recover as temperatures fall. If you respond to every drooping leaf with more water without touching the mix, you can create a cycle of overwatering. Check first, then act. This is the moment when the gardener stops chasing the plant with a watering can. Morning looks fine. Afternoon looks terrible. More water goes in. The next afternoon looks terrible again. The cycle continues because nobody is checking what is actually happening below the surface. Once you start using the root zone as evidence, the garden becomes easier to understand. Now, let us leave the trellis and the strawberry pot for a moment, because ground cherry gives you a harvest signal that looks like failure until you understand the plant. Ground cherry is not a cherry tree. It is a small physalis crop that produces sweet fruit inside a papery husk. It fits small space gardening well because the plant stays relatively manageable, and it brings a completely different rhythm to the patio. Instead of supporting a heavy melon in a sling, you watch the husk mature and the fruit begin to fall. For many crops, fruit dropping makes a gardener nervous. With ground cherry, a dry, papery husk and fruit dropping naturally can be part of the harvest clue. That is a wonderful pattern interruption after spending half the summer trying to prevent melons from falling off a trellis. Still, do not collect every fallen husk and assume the fruit is ready. An immature fruit can fall early. Open or inspect the husk. A ripe ground cherry should have developed its mature color and flavor rather than remaining green. The papery wrapper should be dry. If the fruit is still distinctly green, do not treat "it fell" as the only evidence. Collect ripe fallen fruit regularly, especially if the patio stays damp after watering or rain. Leaving fruit hidden under dense foliage for long periods can invite damage. A clean surface beneath the plant makes harvest easier. Some gardeners place a light mulch or clean collection surface around the container so the small fruits are easier to see. Ground cherry also gives the audio a useful lesson. Harvest behavior can be crop specific. Falling fruit is good evidence here. The same behavior would be a problem for a heavy, trellised melon. Gardening becomes less confusing when you stop expecting every fruit to communicate in the same language. That brings us to fig, and the entire container plan changes again. A melon is usually part of one warm season cycle. A container-grown fig is a perennial project. The question is no longer only, can this plant produce fruit this summer? The question becomes, can I manage this root system, this container, and this climate over several seasons? For an edible common fig, start with a cultivar suited to your climate and your intended container system. Do not assume every ornamental plant sold with the word fig in its name is the fruiting tree you want. A real edible fig in a container needs meaningful root space. A pot around 18 inches in diameter is a practical starting point for a young container fig, but expect the long-term plan to include monitoring root, crowding, repotting, or root management as the plant matures. The reason a container can be valuable is control. You can place the fig in a sunny summer location. In regions with cold winters, a movable container may let you provide protection that would be harder for an in-ground tree. But that mobility disappears if you choose a decorative stone pot so heavy that nobody can move it once it is full of wet mix. Think one season ahead. A strong container with drainage, a stable base, and a plan for moving the plant is more useful than a pot chosen only for appearance. If you live in a region where winter cold can damage the fig, the container strategy should include where the plant will go before cold weather arrives. Fig also begins our final lesson about ripeness. A fruit can look complete long before it is ready. With figs, watch the position and feel of the fruit. A ripening fig often softens, develops a sweeter aroma, and begins to droop or hang downward, rather than holding a firm, rigid posture from the stem. A hard fruit with a stiff neck is usually telling you to wait. Do not squeeze hard. A ripe fig is delicate. Use your fingertips gently and look at the whole fruit. Has it softened? Has the color changed in the way that cultivar should? Is it beginning to droop? Does it smell sweet? Several clues agreeing are more useful than one aggressive squeeze. And after a summer of learning to read vines, flowers, roots, and fruit, the last crop asks us to think about scale one more time. Container-trained passion fruit may live with its roots in a pot, but above the soil, it behaves like it has never heard the phrase small space garden. That is why I saved it for the end of the list. Passion fruit is not my recommendation for the gardener who wants a tiny plant beside a chair. It is a vigorous vine that needs a serious support plan. The container is part of the management system, not a promise that the plant will remain compact. Choose a large container with excellent drainage and enough weight or stability that a mature vine does not tip the whole system. Then build the trellis before the vine needs it. A weak decorative fan trellis may look fine beside a young plant, but a productive passion fruit vine can create a dense wall of stems and leaves. Give it a support you trust. Train the main growth where you want the permanent framework to develop. Check ties as stems thicken. Prune and guide with a purpose rather than cutting randomly every time the vine looks large. The goal is to keep the plant accessible, maintain light and airflow, and prevent it from taking over every neighboring container. Climate matters here more than it did with many of the annual melons. Passion fruit can be sensitive to cold, and the best cultivar depends on where you live. In a warm climate, the vine may remain outside much longer. In a colder region, a container can give you mobility, but moving a mature vine is not simple if it has permanently wrapped itself through a fixed railing. Think about winter before you let the first tendril choose the architecture. Flowering can also bring us back to the pollination lesson. Passion fruit pollination varies with species and cultivar. Some types are more self-compatible than others, and pollinator activity can affect fruit set. So once again, a vine covered in spectacular flowers does not automatically guarantee a bowl full of fruit. Know the plant you bought. Watch the flowers. Watch for fruit set. Do not diagnose a flowering problem with fertilizer alone. And now, after 14 fruits, we finally reach the mistake I warned about at the beginning. It is the mistake you can make after the cultivar was right, the pot was large enough, the vine was managed, the roots stayed reasonably stable, the flowers were pollinated, and the fruit actually grew. You harvest too early. This is where impatience becomes the final pest in the garden. A melon can reach full size and still need time. Color can shift slowly. Aroma may develop. A stem connection may change. The clue depends on the crop. If you copy one ripeness test across every melon on the patio, you can do everything else correctly and still cut open disappointing fruit. Start with watermelon. I want several clues to agree before I harvest. Look at the ground spot, the area where the fruit rested against the surface. As many watermelons mature, that spot shifts toward a creamy yellow rather than remaining pale white. Then find the tendril closest to the fruit stem. A dry, brown tendril can be another useful maturity clue. Look at the rind and the overall appearance of the fruit. I do not let one dramatic thump make the entire decision for me. The famous thump test is tempting because it feels simple. Tap the fruit, hear a sound, declare it ripe. But sound is subjective, and beginners can convince themselves that almost any watermelon sounds hollow. Use multiple clues: ground spot, nearby tendril, rind appearance. Days to maturity as a rough guide from the cultivar, not as a stopwatch. When several signs line up, the decision becomes more confident. And remember, watermelon does not meaningfully continue ripening after you cut it from the vine. This is not the fruit to harvest green and leave on the counter hoping sweetness will arrive later. The vine is where the final ripening needs to happen. Then move to cantaloupe, and the conversation changes. With many muskmelons and cantaloupes, aroma becomes more useful. The background color of the rind can change. And on cultivars that develop a slip stage, the stem attachment begins to loosen. At full slip, the ripe fruit separates easily from the vine with gentle pressure. You should not need to twist until the stem tears. But do not force the full slip rule onto every melon. Honeydew and other melon types can use different maturity clues and may not separate from the stem the same way. This is exactly why the crop-specific lesson matters. A harvest test borrowed from watermelon is not automatically the test for cantaloupe, and a cantaloupe stem test is not automatically the test for every smooth-skinned melon. Amy Canary melon gives you a stronger color clue. Watch for the rind to move toward its mature bright yellow. Melamon gives you another visual change as the rind shifts from green toward chartreuse. Those changes are useful because they turn ripeness into something you can observe. But even then, look at the entire fruit and the cultivar description. One patch of yellow caused by sun exposure is not the same thing as the normal maturity color of the whole melon. Ground cherry speaks a completely different harvest language. The husk dries, and ripe fruit often drops. Fig asks you to watch softness, aroma, and the way the fruit begins to droop. Passion fruit should develop its own color and drop behavior, depending on the type. 14 fruits, and the garden has given you 14 versions of the same lesson. The plant is always giving information, but you have to learn which information matters. So, which fruit should you grow first? If your biggest problem is limited vine space, a truly bushy or short-vined melon, such as Cal Sweet Bush or Minnesota Midget, deserves a closer look. If you want the visual satisfaction of training a fruiting vine upward and supporting a melon in a sling, Orange Silver Wave creates that kind of project. If you want a smaller fruiting plant with a harvest behavior that is easy to observe, Ground Cherry can be a fun change from melons. If you want a perennial container project, a common edible fig changes the timeline from one summer to several seasons. And if you are ready to manage a serious vine with a real trellis, passion fruit can turn vertical space into the main part of the garden. The best choice depends on which problem your space can solve. A tiny balcony may have excellent vertical support but almost no floor area. A sunny deck may have plenty of room for 2 large pots, but terrible reflected afternoon heat. A small backyard patio may have a perfect edge for trailing watermelon vines. Another gardener may need every container to remain movable. The fruit that works for one space can become frustrating in another. But that patience is part of the harvest. You do not need to make a small patio behave like a farm. Choose fruit that fits the space. Learn what the flowers are telling you. Protect the roots when summer gets hard. Give the vines somewhere to go, and give a hanging fruit something to rest in. Then wait for the ripeness clue that belongs to that crop. A small container garden does not become productive because every plant is small. It becomes productive when the root space, the vine, the support, and the summer routine finally fit together. And when the first properly ripened fruit comes off that plant and into your kitchen, when you cut through the rind and see the color you were waiting for, the size of the garden suddenly feels a lot less important.